Living in Europe, anywhere in Europe, had been a dream of mine since college before I even visited the continent. I was drawn by the promise of different cultures, languages, landscapes, and being able to access it all by train. Of course, I was imagining more of a twee Harry Potter style train and less of the Tom Cruise hanging over a Norwegian Death Valley kind. 10 years ago, we made it happen. My wife and I left our beloved hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, and ended up in Germany. And although I expected our lives would change, I never expected how much I personally would change. And I'm not just talking about becoming a German citizen, which I did in July of 2024 after successfully explaining the difference between der, die, and das, or in English, the, and the, without going insane. My name is Joe Bauer, an American immigrant living in and traveling around Europe over the past 10 years. And in this video, I'm going to share all the ways Germany and Europe broadly have changed me. And I bet you'll never see the last one coming. But please don't, just skip ahead. The idea of these teases is that you watch through the whole video and get rewarded with the treat at the end. It's like what Pink Floyd said, "How can you have any pudding if you don't eat your meat?" Which is ironically a terrible metaphor for me, but you'll see why soon enough. Now, if you've been around the channel, you know I hold an intense loathing for American car-oriented hellscapes. I hate any environment that forces you to get into a car, a glorified weapon that kills tens of thousands of Americans a year, often due to the irresponsible driving of someone who passed a test one time when they were 16. But I was fortunate in the US to fashion a life for myself that largely removed me from cars. That said, we were a rarity in a sea of horse-powered metal. We'd still have to take Ubers to visit family or friends in the suburbs. Public transit just wasn't a fast and reliable option to go outside of the city. But in Europe, whether it's my day-to-day life in Berlin or traveling around the continent, I'm almost never in a car. Even in Cyprus, where we were just a couple of weeks ago, we were able to take buses all over the country. We even stumbled across a bus in an abandoned Turkish village at the end of a long trail run. It was public transit kismet. I knew when we moved here we would live car-free, but what I didn't anticipate is just how much I could truly remove myself from ever having to get into a car. Years ago, I joked that I knew how to pour a bowl of cereal and that was enough. My wife did the cooking and I did the dishes. But it wasn't until I moved to Germany that things started to change. I actually wrote and filmed a piece all about this, but the short version is this. Over time, I started to feel like the proverbial schlubby CBS sitcom husband. You know, the Kevin James type with the hot wife he didn't deserve. Although she never complained about our you cook, I clean arrangement, I decided I wanted to be able to, cook for my wife. So she taught me how to make the burritos we'd have once or twice a week. And I realized I like chopping things. It's very satisfying. But then I wondered, what else can I make? Melanie would tap into her Greek heritage for special meals and such. Now me, as I've said in other videos, I'm a Swiss, British Isles ethnic mutt of an Irish Ashkenazi Jew. Rolls right off the tongue. Of my ethnic tapestry, it was the Jewish side that came with any culinary roots in the family. So I started digging through family recipes, researching the history, and over time, I became enthralled, absolutely enthralled with my ancestral cuisine. Now fast forward to today, I'm the one doing most of the cooking, both because I have the more flexible schedule and I genuinely enjoy it. Few things beat being able to put something into your loved one's mouth and just watch them melt with absolute pleasure. Wait, that came out wrong, but you know what I mean. Speaking of the Yidden, I became Jewish, or Jewish-er, whatever you like. My Jewish roots come from my dad's side, which I know to some makes me about as Jewish as a pair of plaid khakis. But being in Germany really pushed me to dig deeper into my heritage. For example, I found out where some of my great-grandparents came from and went on heritage trips to both Slovakia and Romania. In Sziget, I participated in a Jewish food workshop at the Elie Wiesel Museum, preparing a big batch of kashka varnishkas for the people.
Kasha?
Over time, I became increasingly invested in this side of my heritage, the history beyond the pogroms and the Holocaust, and the Yiddish culture that I recognize in my own family, and the way we talk, how we communicate, and even the words peppered throughout our language. Conversational overlapping is not rude, and that is a hill I will die on. I became a regularly published Jewish food writer and even a correspondent for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And then when we moved to Berlin, I helped start a group for secular international Jews that celebrates major holidays together and usually does a Shabbat about once a month out at a restaurant. I'm hardly alone in this. I've met plenty of Jews over the years from around the world who are mostly ambivalent about their Jewishness before moving to Germany or just Europe in general. But I guess there's just something about passing all those memorials to the Jews who were murdered that makes you think, maybe I should care about where I come from. And Germany, of all places, made me more Jewish. Trust me when I say I did not see that one coming. And now, full circle on the food, I became a vegetarian after moving to Germany. Here's what happened. Our burritos, the ones I mentioned earlier making when I learned to cook, originally included chicken. I honestly can't say when I decided to stop adding chicken or specifically why. Was it the physical handling of the meat that turned me off? I don't know, maybe. All I know is that eventually I decided it wasn't necessary. Not to mention, I especially became drawn to the simple dishes of the Jewish culinary canon. Kashka varnishkas, cholent, and matzo ball soup, dishes that were either inherently vegetarian to begin with or easy to make vegetarian. Then I started finding justifications for my fledgling vegetarianism all over the place, both from Jewish sources like the history of Jewish vegetarianism and humanitarian principles drawn from Jewish values, as well as a growing discomfort of not knowing where my food was actually coming from. Once we moved to Berlin, it was game over for the meat. Berlin is arguably the most vegan and vegetarian friendly city in the Western world. Here, you rarely have to look at a menu in advance to know whether or not they'll have something for you as a vegetarian. Honestly, more often than not, an entire section will be dedicated to vegans or vegetarians, and there is no shortage of vegan/vegetarian restaurants and bakeries. Really, the only downside is that it's absolutely spoiled us for whenever we travel to meatier parts of the world or back to the US, where our options are usually a salad or a fake meat burger. I don't want a fake meat burger, I'm a vegetarian because I like the veggies! Wild concept, I know. Americans take up more space, plain and simple. But I've gotten used to our smaller apartment. In fact, I'm often grateful to have a smaller apartment because it stops me from buying shit I don't need. Now, that's not to say that I was exactly the poster child of consumerism when I lived in the US, but I would, for example, buy a t-shirt from whatever city I was visiting if I liked that city. But I don't even do that anymore because I know I already have t-shirts I don't wear regularly and should donate to charity. Plus, space is limited in our apartment. I don't need to clutter it by buying anything I don't truly need or value. From my wife's perspective, the smaller living has meant an escape from fast fashion. In the US, she was much more likely to buy cheap clothes on a whim. Here, she's more selective and will instead spend more on higher quality clothing. But the smaller living isn't just about combating consumerism, it impacts other aspects of our lives, like forcing us to go to the grocery store more often because we have a smaller fridge. Luckily, we have a decently sized store just down the block, so I'll stop in every other day or so on my way back from the gym. Easy peasy. Living in Europe, I definitely travel more than I did in the US. This can be chalked up to a combination of factors, namely more vacation time and more varied and affordable transportation options. In the US, as you've heard me kvetch about before, so much of travel boils down to driving, which in and of itself is a costly expense both financially and in time. Owning and operating a car costs over $11,000 a year, and unlike with a train, you can't work while you're on the move. Busting out your laptop behind the wheel generally won't end well. Add to that the limited vacation days, a lack of transit alternatives, and more expensive airfare, my weekends living in Chicago or Cleveland generally meant sticking around the neighborhood. When we moved to Germany, we were traveling once or twice a month, even though we made less money than when we lived in the United States. But even on a lower income, we could at the very least still afford regional train tickets for a weekend getaway or grab a cheap Ryanair flight for anything too far to train. The relative ease and access to travel in Europe is one of the many reasons it would be difficult for me to go back to full-time living in the US. I don't even need the trains to be high speed necessarily. I'm a simple man. Regional trains around the state would do the trick, please and thank you. I've talked before about how I came to enjoy the outdoors, but felt disconnected from national or state parks while living in the United States. But in Europe, cities often have large parks or even forests where you can escape for an afternoon. In Berlin, for example, we've got Tiergarten and Grunewald, just to name a couple of examples. And when traveling, it seems like there's always a national or state park just a short train or bus ride away, whether it's in Germany, France, Spain, Finland, or again, Cyprus. Just as cooking more turned me into a food writer, spending more time outdoors turned me into an adventure travel writer and filmmaker. Now I'll gleefully spend as much time outdoors as possible, digging into the history and culture of a region through its trails. And now it's become virtually impossible for us to plan a trip without spending some time in the countryside. Or in this case, falling face first into a lake. But it's not just about travel and national parks. Here there are just more public spaces that encourage people to be outside in the city. This is especially true in Berlin, where city benches and parks fill up with picnickers as soon as the winter cold eases up and gives way to spring. One of my favorite things in Germany is to just see someone standing on the sidewalk, facing the sun and soaking up as much vitamin D as humanly possible. But that honestly might be a uniquely German thing, where we'll go a solid 3 months or so without regular sunshine. It's as depressing as it sounds. Now here's the one I teased early on. I like to think I've always been empathetic to immigrants and refugees, but there's simply no replacement for sharing a lived experience. And although I will be the first to admit that I am definitely a privileged immigrant, I've still lived the immigrant experience in a way I never had before just by living in the United States. And anytime you can share an experience with someone, you're just naturally going to be more empathetic to others who have had that same experience. Especially those who might not be as privileged as you, whether it's because they're economic immigrants or refugees from war. And on that latter point, living in Europe has brought me closer to the events of the world. When we moved to Dusseldorf, we lived alongside Syrian refugees. In Berlin, we saw the Ukrainian refugees arriving to our central station when Russia invaded 4 years ago. Obviously, refugees have gone to the US, but for most Americans, it's a story you see on the news. In a major European city like Berlin, it's right outside your front door. Americans, by and large, are privileged to never experience the consequences of our oftentimes disastrous foreign policy. We bomb Iran, for example, but it's the Gulf states and the people living there who feel the ramifications of that decision. In much of the US, the world is a television show you can turn off whenever you feel like it. But here, it's felt in a way I never could have imagined back when I was just a 20-something living in Cleveland. And it naturally makes me feel more connected to the world and more invested in what's happening, which in turn makes me want to be more informed. All in all, I'm incredibly grateful for how living here over the past 10 years has changed me. In many ways, I feel like I'm living the mythical American dream, which is something I talk about in this video. Let's just say I'll never look at an Applebee's quite the same way again.